The collapse of an icon. The unraveling of the political career of the woman once hailed as the most untouchable figure in the history of the European project did not happen behind the closed doors of a smoke-filled room, or through the slow, agonizing leak of a whistleblower's private diary. Instead, it occurred with the sudden, violent clarity of a lightning strike on live television, broadcast to a stunned global audience that watched, in real time, as the foundations of the Parliament began to crumble. The European Court of Justice, an institution traditionally known for its dry, technical adherence to treaty law and its glacial pace of deliberation, suddenly transformed into a judicial guillotine. It dropped a ruling so fundamentally devastating and so legally absolute that the shockwaves were felt instantly. From the corridors of power in Washington to the smallest administrative offices in Eastern Europe. This was not a document that merely hinted at the possibility of a breach of protocol. It wasn't one that suggested a parliamentary committee should perhaps look into certain administrative irregularities with an eye toward future reform. No, this was a total and uncompromising dismantling of a presidency, a legal autopsy of a leadership that the court deemed to be not only flawed, but fundamentally predatory toward the very democratic values it claimed to champion. Within mere minutes of the ruling being announced, the entire executive office of Ursula von der Leyen descended into a state of absolute lockdown. It was a frantic, desperate attempt to contain a radioactive legal fallout that was already leaking through every digital and diplomatic channel available. The court's language left no room for the usual political maneuvering. There was no space for the strategic ambiguity that has defined the Brussels elite for decades, and no path for a face-saving exit strategy that would allow the president to retain even a shred of her former dignity. By ordering her immediate resignation, the court effectively declared that the woman who had spent years positioning herself as the moral and political conscience of the European Union was, in fact, legally and ethically unfit to hold any public office, let alone the most powerful position on the continent. The verdict delivered. The reasons for this unprecedented judicial intervention were read aloud in a courtroom that had become the center of the world's gravity. As each charge was leveled, the weight of the betrayal became more suffocating. This was not the work of a partisan smear campaign or the product of a coordinated attack by political rivals in the populist right or the far left. This was the highest legal authority of the European Union itself, the very body tasked with interpreting the sacred treaties of the member states, stating, with total finality, that the president had used the vast, complex machinery of European democracy as if it were her own private instrument of power and her personal financial reserve. The corruption uncovered by the investigators was described not as a series of minor technicalities or a collection of unfortunate paperwork errors that could be corrected with a few updated filings, but as a systematic and deliberate effort to bypass the law for the sake of political control and personal gain. We are talking about the movement of billions of euros, the orchestration of secret deals conducted on private devices far away from the eyes of public auditors, and a culture of secrecy that treated transparency as an obstacle to be avoided rather than a requirement to be met. The moment the Chief Justice finished reading the first several pages of the ruling, the entire Western political order, which had relied on von der Leyen as a symbol of stability and continuity, began to tremble under the weight of the realization that the center could no longer hold. The three pillars of the scandal. Only 72 hours prior, the Court of Justice of the European Union had convened for what was expected to be a consequential hearing. But few truly grasped that it would become the most significant judicial event in the history of any European institution. This was far removed from the routine legal proceedings that usually occupy the court's docket. It was certainly not the equivalent of a parliamentary committee producing a heavily redacted, strongly worded report destined to gather dust on a shelf while the status quo remained unchallenged. This was an emergency session of Europe's supreme judicial authority, convened with the specific and exclusive purpose of determining whether the sitting president of the European Commission had committed acts of corruption so severe and so fundamentally incompatible with her duties that the only remedy was her immediate and forced removal from the world stage. The courtroom was packed to the rafters with legal observers, high-ranking diplomats from every major European capital, and a phalanx of international journalists who realized that the air in the room was charged with the electricity of a turning point in history. When the Chief Justice finally opened his mouth to deliver the verdict, the silence that fell over the room was not merely a sign of respect. It was that heavy, pregnant silence that only occurs when every individual in a building understands they are witnessing the end of an era and the destruction of a legacy. The first finding was the one that immediately ignited the internet, sending social media into a frenzy of disbelief and outrage. The judges ruled with total clarity that von der Leyen had engaged in a systematic, calculated, and deliberate misuse of European Union environmental funds through what is known as the LIFE program. To the average citizen, the LIFE program is marketed as a noble and essential pillar of the EU's green transition. A multi-billion euro fund supported by the hard-earned money of taxpayers across 27 different nations, all under the promise that these resources would be used to save ancient forests, restore the ecological health of polluted rivers, and build the infrastructure necessary for a sustainable, carbon-neutral future. It was supposed to be the ultimate expression of European solidarity in the face of a global climate crisis. However, the court's investigation found something that can only be described as a grotesque inversion of those goals. Instead of the money flowing toward conservation and real climate action, a significant and staggering portion of these environmental funds have been quietly and deliberately redirected under the president's personal authority. This money was not being used to protect the earth. It was being funneled into sophisticated, high-budget political media campaigns designed for the explicit purpose of silencing, discrediting, and ultimately destroying anyone who dared to voice a critical opinion of the European Commission's climate policies. A weaponized presidency. The court was explicit in its assertion that this was not a case of administrative incompetence or a failure of oversight. The evidence trail showed that the diversion of these funds required deliberate, high-level authorization that could only have come from the very top of the hierarchy. Scientists, journalists, and public intellectuals who raised legitimate, data-driven questions about the economic feasibility or the scientific basis of certain regulations found themselves the targets of well-funded hit pieces and digital suppression operations, all paid for with the very money the public believed was being used for environmental charity. This was a weaponization of the public purse to protect a political agenda from the scrutiny of a free and open democratic debate. The idea that the woman entrusted with the protection of Europe's democratic institutions was using green energy money to run shadow campaigns against her own citizens was a revelation so damning it would have ended any normal political career in a matter of seconds. Yet, the court was only just beginning to peel back the layers of the scandal. The second finding moved the ruling from the realm of political scandal into the territory of a criminal indictment, of judgment so catastrophic that it became impossible for even her most loyal defenders to utter a word in her favor. This finding centered on the events of 2021, a year defined by the height of the global pandemic, when governments across the continent were operating under a cloud of fear and intense public pressure to secure life-saving vaccines for their populations. It was in this climate of emergency that von der Leyen made a decision that fundamentally bypassed every rule of procurement, every safeguard against corruption, and every democratic principle that the European Union claims to represent. She personally and unilaterally negotiated the single largest vaccine procurement contract in the history of Europe, a deal for 1.88 billion doses of the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, worth tens of billions of euros in taxpayer money. But the court found that she did not do this through official, transparent channels mandated by law. She did not convene the appropriate technical committees. She did not follow the strict procurement statutes that ensure fair competition and public value. And she did not allow the sovereign member states to review the terms of the agreement before it was finalized. Instead, she conducted the entire multi-billion euro negotiation through a series of private text messages and personal phone calls directly with the CEO of Pfizer, Albert Bourla. The court's finding was that these communications were conducted specifically and intentionally to avoid the transparency requirements that are the bedrock of European law, ensuring that the terms of the deal would never be subject to the kind of public scrutiny or democratic oversight that a contract of this magnitude requires. When members of the European Parliament exercised their legal right to demand access to those messages, von der Leyen's office claimed that the records simply did not exist anymore, asserting that the text had been deleted in the normal course of business. The court rejected this explanation in its entirety. It stated that the deletion of official communications relating to such a massive public expenditure constituted a deliberate obstruction of democratic accountability. The ruling went even further, noting that the financial terms of the contract, which remain largely hidden from the public, contain provisions so overwhelmingly favorable to the pharmaceutical giant and so potentially disadvantageous to the citizens of Europe, that the public has a fundamental legal right to know exactly what was exchanged in those deleted messages. Institutional contempt. As the reading continued, the tension in the courtroom reached a breaking point with the third finding, which focused on the consulting scandal that had followed her since her tenure at the German Defense Ministry. This was not merely a finding of financial irregularity. It was a finding of institutional contempt. During her time in Berlin, her office had authorized the spending of over 200 million euros in a single year on external consulting firms, like McKinsey and Accenture, to advise on everything from defense policy to administrative reform. The court noted that while governments often hire consultants, the manner in which these contracts were awarded was a flagrant violation of both German and European law. Mandatory public tender processes, designed specifically to prevent powerful officials from directing public money to their personal friends, financial associates, or political allies, were completely ignored. Contract after contract, totaling hundreds of millions of euros, was handed out in the dark without a single competitive bid. When investigators finally demanded the documentation that would justify these massive expenditures, they found that the records were missing, incomplete, or had been destroyed in a pattern that the court ruled was not accidental, but was instead a systematic strategy to avoid accountability. The ruling explicitly named von der Leyen as the official who bore direct institutional responsibility for this culture of secrecy and lawlessness. The end of an era. By the time the Chief Justice had finished reading all three findings, the political world outside the courtroom had already erupted into a state of total chaos. A spokeswoman for the president appeared on camera looking visibly shaken, delivering a prepared statement that was only 5 lines long and failed to address a single one of the court's devastating conclusions. In the hallways of the European Parliament, members were flooding the press areas, while global markets began to react to the sudden instability of the European executive. Somewhere in the heights of the Berlaymont building, the president was facing the ultimate crisis of her life. A ruling that left no room for interpretation, no possibility of a legal appeal, and no face-saving exit. The question that is now tearing the European Union apart is not whether the law was broken. The court has already decided that it was, but whether the entire structure of the Union can survive the fallout of such a total betrayal of the public trust. The findings are now a permanent part of the historical record. The environmental money used for political hit jobs, the vaccine deals made in secret texts, and the consulting contracts handed out in the dark. Ursula von der Leyen is finished as a political force. As her inner circle begins to fracture and her former allies scramble to distance themselves from the wreckage of her career, the only question that remains is how much of the European project she will take down with her. The political survival instinct in Brussels is a powerful force, and right now, every ambitious official is calculating exactly how far they need to run before the entire structure collapses under the weight of its own corruption, leaving a fractured continent to pick up the pieces of a shattered legitimacy. This is the end of the line for the woman who thought she was above the law, and the world is watching to see if the institution she led can ever truly recover from the damage she has done.